3 years ago, I joined KPMG. We're in the major projects advisory team. I broker conversations and strategies between government and the private sector to try and get ultimately a better deal for infrastructure, a better deal for citizens ultimately. I have a strong belief that infrastructure has a big impact on our everyday lives, whether that's the schools that educate our children, I've got 2 kids at home, or it's the hospitals that cure our families. Infrastructure and construction is a wonderful industry. It does so much good for the average person. There are so many facets to construction and infrastructure. My advice would be to... Well, I'm an engineer from background to start with. I come back from a long history of engineers. My brother is an engineer, my grandfather's an engineer, so engineering is in the family for sure. But I suppose a few years ago, I kind of started to find I sort of reached a sort of ceiling point, if you like, in my engineering career, where the technical component, if you like, of what I was doing kind of, sort of plateaued, I suppose. And I really wanted to kind of get sort of into a different type of room to understand where some of the key decisions were happening much earlier on, and use the skills and the knowledge I've got from a sort of practical perspective to kind of influence those decisions right at the very beginning. So yeah, 3 years ago, I joined KPMG. I'm a director now within the major projects advisory team, and I guess, I tend to sort of describe my role as a bit sort of like marriage counselling, I suppose. I broker conversations and strategies between government and the private sector to try and get ultimately a better deal for infrastructure, a better deal for citizens ultimately.
What is it that you're trying to achieve then overall? You say a better deal, but what's your ambition?
What is the ambition? So I have a strong belief that infrastructure has a big impact on our everyday lives, whether that's the schools that educate our children, I've got 2 kids at home, or it's the hospitals that cure our families. They're really important to everyday lives. But I think infrastructure is generally done quite badly. It's done badly from the perspective of those who are going to occupy those assets in the future, but it's done badly in terms of the deal for taxpayers, in terms of maximising the investment, whether government or even the private sector is putting into it. So what I want to be able to do is use those skills to be able to influence, again, right at the very beginning of those projects or those programmes, to ultimately allow the projects to be more successful, so the outcomes, the outputs are more successful, again, so citizens get a better deal.
Can you give me an example of where a project has been done badly?
Wow. So I think you can look in the press and there's lots of doom and gloom in terms of projects that haven't been done sort of particularly well. It's very difficult to sort of point on a specific one, but I think just the general, Professor Flyberg, for example, speaks very well in his book and the evidence that he's accumulated in terms of major projects, and I suppose the number of which don't deliver on the outcomes. They're overspent, they're delayed in terms of the outcomes. So there's a huge tapestry, if you like, of projects, and I suppose the bigger and the more complex they get, the more likelihood, unfortunately, that the outcomes don't deliver on what they were intending to do. I think people know exactly what are the bad examples in the market right now.
What do you think that can be done to make these large-scale projects deliver on their initial ambition or initial promise?
So I think it, again, starts right at the beginning. So understanding, what is the core objectives of what we want to be able to achieve from this project? How does it link to economic benefits? How does it bring value to the citizens, to the member of the public? Get really clear about that.
So is that the case already? Are organisations, so talking government as well as industry, are they really clear on that ambition from the start?
I don't think they're as clear as they can be.
Okay.
I think ultimately it becomes quite murky with a lot of different sort of competing priorities, let's say. So then when you get sort of further down the life cycle, if you like, on that project, then certain decisions again are made, which then brings it away from what that core intention was going to be. So that's why I think it's really important to get it very clear right at the beginning, and you hold on to that as the core principles as that project does mature.
So is this a case then of things being fairly clear or clear enough from the beginning, but then as time moves on, other interested parties muddy the waters?
I think there's a bit of both. So certainly I think at the very beginning, those clear objectives aren't as clear as they could be. I think that, again, there's a lot of murkiness in terms of, okay, what is the strategic outcome that we want to achieve from this? And almost unfortunately have some of those difficult conversations about how you compete against those different things. So whether that is the impact on the environment, whether that's the impact on social outcomes, whatever it might be, but have very clear outcomes in terms of how they sort of sit. And then ultimately, as you start to run through the project itself, you can then sort of keep focused around what those core objectives are.
Talk to me about the role that you have advising the government. You described that wonderful analogy about you being a marriage counsellor.
Yes.
What is it that you're trying to do for the government to satisfy them or to support them in their responsibility and their roles?
Yeah, so much of it is about stakeholder engagement. So working with the government and different sort of facets of government, whether that's central, so cabinet, HMT, etc., or the actual government department and the stakeholders within the department itself. So helping them to really get very, very clear about what those core objectives are, what is it we want to achieve from this program. Then ultimately, how do you then change that into a delivery strategy? So how do you engage with the market? Who are the key partners you need to have on board very early? And how does that change through the maturity of the project? So just get clarity in terms of that stakeholder engagement very, very much at the very beginning of the project.
What changes have you seen with the current government based on the previous government? And this question isn't to try and say that one's better than the other. I'm just looking for what changes and shifts that you've seen.
Yeah, I think it's quite early to tell. I mean, because obviously the new government is only just sort of in power, and there's a bit of time to be able to sort of come through in terms of what that means and how investment is going to be made. But certainly there's some key sort of focuses, of course, around sort of energy and energy security. So I spend a lot of time in my life around that sort of sector. Housing as well, particularly around social housing. So we not only need to build a lot of housing, but we also need to build them at a point which has got the right quality, meeting the right environmental impacts, sustainability, etc. But also at a point that general people can be able to afford as well. So definitely a lot of pressure around networks, energy security, housing. So again, the core themes are perhaps very, very similar, but perhaps how the focus in which the new government are placing is perhaps different than perhaps it was in the previous government. I certainly, in my interfaces so far, there feels like a renewed energy around the sort of government departments. You have this opportunity to change, to reconfigure, to reset, I suppose, in a certain way, and come after some of these real thorny issues in a much more driven way, perhaps, than what has been in the last 18 months, 12 months or so.
Do you think that building new houses is really going to lower the cost of houses and make it more affordable for people to buy?
Well, I guess, I'm an engineer, not an economist now, but I guess the fundamental is if you put more available on the market, then there'll be a sort of increased supply versus the demand. So by instinct, you'd expect that the price to come down. But of course, it's far more sort of complex from that. And as we talked about before, there are lots of different people and businesses that need to come together to be able to deliver better outcomes. As an engineer, and I spent many years designing housing and residential projects, I believe there's a lot of inefficiency in the current system, not only in terms of how projects are set up, but also how they're delivered as well. And so I think we can do better. I think the supply chain can do better. I think contractors can do better. I think the way we manage land could be better. And again, if we think about it again from the eyes of the citizen, what we're trying to do is increase the amount of housing, but again at the right quality points, i.e. the consumers can trust that the homes they're buying are at the right quality point. They're not going to be full of defects, etc. That they are energy efficient. We're all going into, unfortunately, we're end of summer, about to go into winter. We've heard some pressures around the sort of the cost of energy going into the winter. So people need homes that are cheap to run. But then again, it's also about how you sort of bring the best of materials. There's lots of innovation in the sector, but most of that is still sort of very juvenile, effectively. We need pilots and some examples to be able to get those things more available, if you like, for the general market to be able to use.
And so I'm wondering now what approaches you have seen that work really well. What's worked really well?
What has worked very well is when you look at the problem as a system, and within that system there are multiple participants, multiple businesses, multiple people who are all involved in trying to achieve the ultimate outcome. Where you have good examples is where you have multiple areas of that value chain all working together to achieve that outcome. So maybe if we perhaps use the housing one as an example, so where you have innovation around how projects are financed and funded, There are some very good innovative financiers out there looking to put more money in housing, but as long as they can trust what the outcomes are going to be. So again, the quality is right, that they are energy efficient, that we are using local skills, we are leveling up, all those right sort of things. So there's innovation within funding. There's innovation in terms of how we open sites, projects, particularly around constrained sites. There's a big push around how do we increase the amount of affordable homes within city areas. And of course, we're in very constrained areas, but there are land parcels which otherwise are undevelopable because of the way that the current market is sort of stacked up. But you bring together innovative finance, you bring together ways in which you could open that land up. Perhaps using modern methods of construction, for example, there's all these different sort of facets, which all of a sudden you then open up these pieces of land which otherwise aren't going to be developed. So where it works well is where you have those multiple layers of that value chain all working together for the common good.
There's been a lot of talk about that over the last few years, about this collaboration. That's generally the word that's used a lot. How do we collaborate? And we are collaborating. And it seems that, if I'm being honest, it seems as though people can convince themselves that they are collaborating when they're not actually. They're more contending than they are collaborating.
You can see how the sector is sort of set up around sort of short-term decisions, if you like. Again, different sort of parts of the value chain all need to come together, but if they're all struggling around how do I keep my business afloat, it's not going to be for the overall benefit of society and of the social outcomes we want to achieve.
So in those scenarios there, just going back to the analogy that you made of you being the marriage counsellor,
yes.
If on the one hand you've got someone that's saying, look, I'm struggling to make my business viable under these current conditions, so I'm driven now for short term. You've got the government which is saying something different. Whether it's this government or another government, I don't think is that relevant. What do you do to try and bring those two parties together to move forward in a way which has got long-term value?
Yes. Well, it's exactly having those very open and honest, sort of transparent conversations. So, for example, from the private sector, business owner, the CEO, for example, of a company is, what are the red lines that you are able to be able to operate in? What areas of risk are you able to accept based on your, core capabilities, on the strategy you have as a business, versus what the government are trying to get from you as a sort of supplier, and translate those back and forth between them to say to the government, well, this is what the market will accept on a reasonable market versus sort of risk versus reward sort of share. So either government needs to come to the table with a different proposition, or it needs to prioritise what it's doing in a slightly different way, because clearly, again, a government coming to market with something which the market isn't able to deliver isn't going to do anyone any favours. So often it's about sort of relaying both between those two parties what is the art of the possible, and trying to sort of broker a sort of an overlap where both parties win to as best possible. Again, there'll always be some compromises, but just understanding where those red lines really do sit. Because quite often you will find that companies, they'll hide behind the contract, so they'll sign up to collaborative clauses, to different types of frameworks, which all on the veneer have around collaboration and problem solving. But the reality is, when the tires hit the rubber, so to speak, and there starts to become sort of challenges in delivery and delays and whatever it might be, that's when you really sort of find the sort of true essence of those individual leaders and their ability to be able to resolve those issues. So it's much better to have those upfront discussions very much earlier, and you write then the commercial terms and the contract around that, rather than finding out very much later. So again, like the marriage counselling, you'd rather have the bit of dating and sort of have those sort of lead ups before you then sort of find yourself married, and a year later, finding out it's not the right partner for you.
That's good. I like that analogy. So you mentioned before about finance, and that there are organisations out there. You didn't say with a stack of money, but in my imagination, they had a stack of money and they're waiting to put the money into projects that have got the criteria that they have met in a really, really good way. What advice or what insight can you give into ways that organisations can get access to those types of funds?
Yeah, I mean, I'd start perhaps with a very broad statement, in the sense that in my experience, there's not a shortage of investment available within construction infrastructure. I think the challenge is that the sector isn't investable as it is at the moment.
What do you mean by that? Because that's a really bold statement.
Yeah.
What you're saying, if I understand this correctly, is that access to funds is not the issue.
Correct.
It's the viability of the project that
Correct.
you want access to those funds for, that's what the issue is.
It's a viability, but it's also the certainty of the outcome. So, think of it from your own perspective. If you were asked to invest some of your own personal money into a project, no matter what it was, but yet the certainty around how much it actually is going to cost, what is actually going to be your return on investment, how long will it take to deliver on that, was all like lost in murkiness and uncertain risk. You're not going to put your money to that. I certainly wouldn't.
Definitely.
So why would you expect a private institution to do the same? So ultimately, again, there isn't a shortage of money, but it's around how do you kind of work through what those risks are, what are the things that we know, what are the control measures we can put in place, and how do you kind of put the right safeguards in during the maturity of that project to make sure that we are sort of on track with what we should be doing, or at least reporting very transparently of where issues are arising and what we're going to do to address it. That's for me is the gap.
I've had a couple of QSs come on the podcast, and they fundamentally said about the same thing, which is when the proposal is put forward in its first instance, everybody knows around the table that number is wrong.
Yes.
And everyone knows that it's far too low. So it seems, listening to what you've said, it's almost like the emperor is walking around with no clothes on.
Absolutely.
But no one yet has found the child to kind of say, look, he's naked.
Yes.
To the point where everyone's like, oh yeah, we all knew that anyway, but we just didn't want to call it out.
Yes. Well, I guess, the sort of challenge is that clients want the project to be successful. They want it to get off the ground, so to speak. So there's a sort of anticipation that if you report the right number, the project never gets legs. It never sort of starts in the first place. But again, I think it's far more successful and, of course, effective to be very open about what the real number is. I think there's also some commercial legacy challenges, if you like. Certainly, you probably heard the expression around sort of competitive tension. You get that.
Yeah, but just explain what that is.
Yeah, I suppose it's that sort of notion where, say, for example, let's do a very simple one. If you wanted to extend your patio at home, for example, you can get one quote from the person that you have been recommended to from a friend, or you can get three quotes from three different companies, and then you can then hold them to account and say, well, Joe, for example, said he can do it for $5,000 less, and Sue said she could do it for $10,000 less. You can play those tunes to be able to get the cheapest possible price. And to some degree, that might work. You might get Sarah or Joe to be able to lower their price by £3,000. But of course, what that has resulted in is that company now has taken on a project which they probably will make a loss on, or at least at best sort of make costs stack up. So as a result, they're going to look for ways in which they can recover that loss. They'll look for ways to, overcharge materials or penalise you for, a change in which perhaps you or your wife said you don't want that stone, you want a different stone. So of course they're going to charge you for the additional there. So I think competitive tension is sort of lost in the current sort of way that infrastructure needs to be delivered and the way that citizens need infrastructure to be delivered. And so what I mean by that is having the very, again, open and honest conversations about what is the real cost going to be, how do we get the best from all the different sort of components of the supply chain and bring that best to bear. Because even in sort of the tier ones, in the architectural firms, in the engineering, they all have specialisms, they all have areas which they're good at and things that they're less good at. But what tends to happen is we lose the kind of specialisms, if you like, the USPs that each of them bring. And as a result, we then start to compete very much on the lowest cost. And that's not effective for anybody. It's not effective for that business. It's not effective for, again, the outcome of that project and for society ultimately at the other end of it.
And that was the thing that I was going to move on to, was this concept of value.
Yes.
Because going back again to the analogy that you used in my patio, what I want is a patio that I can sit and have friends around, family around, maybe have a barbecue and have different activities, but without the patio breaking up or things becoming uneven. So that's valuable to me. But if I just focus on the value which can come in pound signs, or in other countries dollar signs or whatever, then that guarantee is not going to be there. I can say, do it for me cheaper, please.
Yes.
And they can say yes, but surely that trade-off, at least in my experience, because I have had this in the past with a drive. I was focused on price on my drive. I had a car that was quite heavy, and I said to them, are you sure that you can do it for this price? Absolutely, Mr. Evans, not a problem, not a problem. 3 years later, under the guarantee, the drive sunk. I went back and said, can you fix my drive because it's sunk? That's not what we agreed. They came back and said, oh, no, we can't do it because your downpipes are running onto the drive, and I didn't think that water was going to be going onto your drive. Now everyone knows that that's not why the drive sunk.
Yes.
But that was the pain that I had, right? That was lacking value. So I guess my question is, where is real value, and what's your definition of value?
Well, I think in your example, you've sort of very well articulated the complexity around the definition of value. And I think it is very different depending on the beholder, so who's sort of describing it. So in your sort of example, clearly there was a price point that you could afford and you wanted to pay, but also you wanted to sort of enjoy the drive where you had a particular heavy car, etc. So ultimately, the definition of value needs to be around the kind of the outcomes you want to achieve from the particular asset. So if you are a governor within a school, for example, ultimately in terms of developing that value proposition, you have to be very clear about where the trade-offs are going to be, such that if you are making compromises, you're at least doing it with your eyes open, so you know what potentially the impact could be. And again, I think that's some of the challenges at the very beginning. We don't really articulate what is value for that particular client or stakeholder. And as a result, they make choices that are perhaps against that, and then they realize at the end of it that it's too late, or is then far more expensive to address it. So I think the definition of value chain, again, what is value has to be articulated very at the beginning, and it has to be very sort of clear and very specific to the particular asset type and what the client wants to achieve from it.
What would you say would be the top 3 things that organizations need to be really clear on before they enter either into a contract or enter into any development?
So I think certainly I'd be amiss if I didn't sort of say price. So having a clear articulation around the sort of budget in terms of the red lines in which you can go and can't do. So what is the funding envelope, and being very clear about what that is. The risk allocation. So you as a client, for example, what elements of risk are you able to hold, whether that means that you have to bring in some additional protections, whether that's insurance or a team to provide assurance, whatever it might be. But what is it you're able to, and what is it you're expecting the supply chain to take as an element of risk? Because certainly cost and the risk distribution is definitely part of it. And I suppose the third is around the sort of the broader outcomes you want to achieve. So whether they are a carbon target you want to achieve, a social value component, whatever it might be. I think those are the 3 things that you really need to articulate very, very clearly at the very beginning.
Can you just go a little bit deeper on risk? Risk seems a bit of a subjective word.
Yes.
What types of risks would organizations need to be clear on in order to move forward with something?
Yes, so I think a common one, for example, is the in-ground risk. So it can work to any sort of asset type, where it's a railway project or a housing project, where it might be. But
what do you mean by in-ground risks?
So, what's below the ground itself. So whether there's contamination, whether there's, in London we have UXO, unexploded bombs are quite relevant and quite typical in certain parts of London. So the unforeseen, if you like, yes, we have technologies that can sort of peer below the surface, but for the average person who doesn't have the superpowers, you don't know what is buried in the ground. You can have services, utilities, those sorts of things. So who owns that ground risk? Is it the client who owns the land itself, or is that risk going to be entirely pushed onto the supply chain? If it is, then there's an element of cost and protection that supply chain needs to have in place to make sure they are protected against it. So, for example, if you are building a hospital, most hospitals have a single, if not a 2-story basement, parking and MEP equipment, etc. So you're going to be digging a lot in the ground. What you don't want to find out later on, once you start that excavation, is again you found UXO, you found ancient artifacts, you found utilities which need to be diverted. All those things are very expensive. They can add a lot on time on the schedule itself. So where does that risk sit? Does it sit with the client who owns the land, or does it sit with the supply chain? Just a really clear articulation where that sits, and ultimately what you can do together to de-risk that. So it might be that the client, for example, up front pays for some additional survey work, some additional boreholes, some intrusive works, for example, to understand what is in the ground. And then together they can then establish what that risk is and what is the supply chain able and willing to take on versus, again, what might stay with the client.
Like that, that's good. What nuggets of wisdom would you give, using again this analogy of marriage counselling? Before you get married, you go through a dating process.
Yes.
what advice would you give for organizations that are going through this dating process?
I think the dating process is exactly right. So I think you can obviously set up tenders where you can. I'm trying to. I've been married for over 11 years, so the sort of online dating is a bit sort of. Well, actually, I never did any of it. To be fair, this is completely off wall. But if you're going down that sort of route, you of course will look at people's profiles, and the same as construction, will look at tenders and reviews from those sorts of things. But there's nothing like, actually going to meet individuals, understanding who are the leaders of these businesses. Are your belief systems in line with each other? Again, the culture of the different businesses, do they line up? Do they stack up? Can you do business with these people? Because again, it is people that are going to make the impact or not. And there's a lot of I suppose brain-orientated decisions, but there's also some heart in there as well. Sometimes we have to go with what our heart is sort of telling us in terms of, based on those discussions, who we think are going to actually be there sort of toe-to-toe when things get rough, to be able to work through challenges and unforeseen, for example, to get through it to the other end. So I think there's sort of two components of picking your supply chain. One is the traditional tendering process, and absolutely has to be done and should be done transparently, cheaper and far more effectively. But it's also the human aspect. How do the teams operate together? How do we lose the badge as we enter into the collective team and work together to work through the solution and deliver the infrastructure?
I like that, that concept that you've spoken about there, because I think that in the pursuit of efficiency, we can look at a profile and say, well, I like the way that they've presented themselves. The colors look nice.
Yeah.
Maybe the video looks good. We'll go with those guys.
Yes. Well, absolutely. And again, but that's a component of the decision making. I suppose the message I want to give is that is just one component. The other component is, again, going to meet the individuals, having a chat with them, whether that is, for coffee, whether it's whatever sort of, social environment you want to sort of pick, but meet those individuals or those leaders or those businesses, understand what makes them tick. And ultimately, again, if there are challenges which come up, and again, construction is complex, there's lots of challenges, like life is very complex. Can you work with those individuals to get through that situation together and stronger? Is it going to be a situation where you're left, like your driveway example, of coming back, within the warranty period and finding out there's a load of caveats? You don't want a partner like that. You want someone to say, look, we made a mistake, we're going to correct it, and this is what we're going to do about it. That's the kind of partnership you want from people.
What could industry do to make government's job easier?
I would certainly come back to what I was mentioning earlier, which is being far more clear about the red lines that you are able to operate in. There's so many discussions that I've been involved in where at the beginning certain commitments and promises were made, but yet when the contract comes out and it comes to that sort of crunch line where you've now got signatures or about to put signatures on a page, quite often the governance process of that particular business, particularly as a big one, would never have signed up to that risk in the first place. But yet there's been a sort of a courting process, if you like, up to that point to suggest that they would be able to do it. So I think certainly having that very open discussion at the very beginning is very much important. I think clearly articulating the risks that you are able to take on board, where there are grey areas, and ultimately, what can you do to help alleviate some of that grey and murkiness for the client. So it might be, again, bring in different teams, different specialisms. It might be doing some additional investigation, like I mentioned with the ground risk, for example. It might be you propose some additional boreholes which you might share the cost of, on the basis that the risk is then shared between you because you both have better insight. So I think rather than sort of just waiting for the risks to materialize, is coming to your client with sort of tangible, this is the situation, this is what we think is the best solution to be able to mitigate against the risk of those.
And in your experience, and this is probably a really difficult question for you to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. In your experience, how understanding or sympathetic are government departments when a private organization comes to them and says, look, we honestly thought this, but it's not the case, and moving forward in this area is no longer viable for us. We need to make some changes, and they're going to be costly changes for you. How sympathetic are they to that?
So I think it's a changing landscape, and I think there are some perhaps who have those very traditional belief systems, again, around competitive tension, squeeze in the supply chain. Government shouldn't hold any risk. All the risk should be in the supply chain. I don't personally subscribe to that. I think there has to be a better balance of the risk sharing between government and private sector. But I think that culture is sort of changing because, again, if you roll up the sort of quantity of things that we have to build, not only in this country, but also on a global scale, we don't have the capacity in the market, we don't have the skills to be able to deliver on the infrastructure and construction pipeline. So fundamentally, we need a different approach. Given the scale and the pace in which we do need to build, not only again to replace aging infrastructure, to improve the networks in terms of greening the grid, making the energy efficient buildings and assets, etc. There's such a phenomenal amount to sort of do. This coming to the market with the same blunt instrument of pushing risk all the way down the supply chain is not going to get the outcomes that we need. So there is a changing in government. There is a changing with individuals who see that there's a different way to procure. You'll see some of that in the tenders that are coming out, where it's not just price. So you haven't got a 70% price, 30% everything else. It is starting to flip the other way. But again, what we do need is more those sort of open conversations around what the supply chain is able to do and where it's not able to do. Only then are we going to be able to start to really move this sort of movement, I suppose, further forward and not keep to where we are at the moment.
What advice are you currently giving the government?
So again, I think with the current landscape with a new government, there is this opportunity to reset, to recalibrate, to refocus on where spend should be going. How do we get better outcomes on infrastructure? Again, so citizens get a better deal. There's clearly some changes within central government. The combination of the IPA with NIC, for example, with NISTA to be the new government department.
So can you just clarify IPA, NIC?
Yes, so the Infrastructure and Projects Association, and the NIC is the National Infrastructure Commission, I think, is the C.
And what do they do?
So they both work within central government, and basically the IPA help to set blueprints for how major projects are set up at the very beginning, but how they're also delivered. So there's part of it is a kind of guidance. The other part is a certain, I suppose, assurance on behalf of the government to make sure the project's on track. They are delivering the benefits they should be. The NIC is a sort of collecting data and evidence, if you like, on again how the performance of capital projects are working and how they can ultimately learn from that. So here is an opportunity where you've got two departments sort of coming together. So there's an opportunity to sort of rewrite the rule book in the sense of how government can support supply chain. Again, it has a huge infrastructure pipeline to be able to build. We need the best of private sector to help to come to that. But what is the service that government need to be able to provide to again, broker that better conversation. So it is an opportunity to relook at how it tenders, to relook at how it sort of gives confidence in the pipeline. Confidence in the pipeline is been a particular sort of barrier, particularly with the sort of shadow, I suppose, of an election over the last sort of 12 to 18 months. Is there going to be a drive for more hospitals? Is there going to be a drive for more schools? Is there going to be more prisons? What is the money going to be allocated? And how confident can you be that supply, that sort of pipeline is consistent? Again, from a business perspective, if you are a business that works across multiple sector, you want to build teams around where you think the confidence is going to be around where the market is. You don't want to build up a huge hospital delivery capability if all of a sudden the money is going to be put towards housing or rail or schools or something. So that consistency and that certainty of the supply of the pipeline is really important.
What are you hoping that the takeaway message is going to be for those people listening to you, be that your colleagues or people that have never heard from you or seen you before?
Yeah, I think innovation is perhaps a word which is sort of thrown around very much similar to collaboration in the sense that it can be seen as a sort of blunt instrument, if you like, and a bit of a sort of a throwaway comment, but very much lacks a substance in terms of delivering on what innovation really means. So again, I think within the current climate we find ourselves, clearly we've got to reduce our impact on the planet. Clearly we've got to do more to be able to help the average citizen. Again, whether that is getting their GP appointment, whether they're getting their dentistry appointment, getting access to the schools and services they need. So there's a real opportunity to kind of look at how the individual, how you within the corporate that you represent can make different decisions around innovation, again, whatever that means for your particular skill set, to be able to come out with a different outcome. We all have our sort of respective agency, if you like, in the way that we make the choices, the way we come up to work. So if you are that person, for example, that is continuously sort of applying a very blunt instrument approach, here is your opportunity to kind of look at a more innovative approach. So how can you kind of get better from the supply chain? How can you kind of look at maybe that risk allocation isn't quite fair as it currently years. So what is it you can do within the agency that you have to help deliver a better outcome?
What would your message be to a leader of a tier 1 company?
I think it's clear to see that the tier 1 community, it's a tough environment. Margins are low and they haven't been good for some time. There are some outliers perhaps that are doing better than others. My message would be, again, stick to your knitting perhaps. Look at the core competencies you have as a business. What is your core foundation of what you do and what you do very well? Focus on that, and perhaps the other things where you might have sort of grown into as a result of, again, perhaps vanity or perhaps an opportunity which hasn't sort of materialized in the way you have. Look at what is core to you and your business and focus effort in that sort of, and I think then the margins are easier to access and more sustainable as a business. I think where my team and I have sort of come in to support tier 1s, it's often where they've sort of grown into areas which are not core to them and they're sort of doing it almost on the side. That is a very risky business, particularly in terms of how projects are set up. As I mentioned all the way through the podcast, there is lots of risk being pushed onto the supply chain. If you're not capable and able to operate and understand those risks, you potentially have your business on the line. So my clear message would be, stick to your knitting, stick to what is core for you and build your business around that rather than building on these extra add-ons which don't drive value for your business.
On a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being absolutely amazing, where would you rate your job at the moment, your current role?
I would like to say 10, but the sort of, I suppose, competitive person myself thinks there's always another layer. So I would say a 9 at the moment.
Okay.
I do have a wonderful team around me. I have some great leadership in the firm that I represent. There's huge amounts of freedom in the business that I operate in, and there's not a shortage of innovation within the sector that is needed. I can clearly without doubt sort of say that I work with some of the most brightest, intelligent people on the planet, and working with those individuals is a real sort of privilege. But also someone like me who perhaps, again, my role as sort of marriage counselling, I can kind of like thrive off the intelligence of other people in the sense of getting the best out of those individuals and how we bring it together for an overall client sort of delivery. But yeah, I'm not bored in what I do. I don't have a shortage in what I can apply my time on. And I think there's just a huge abundance of opportunity out there in the market.
And what advice would you give to someone that is considering their options and maybe thinks construction is all on site, it's all mucky work, it's all dirty stuff, and don't really want to get that dirty? I want to be less physical and more mental. Maybe I want to interchange the physical with the mental stuff. From your time in the construction industry, in your current role, what insight or what guidance would you give?
Well, as I said at the beginning, the infrastructure industry is a phenomenal place to be. You know, there's so much diversity in terms of what you can do, whether that is different skill sets, whether that's the technology that you can access. You know, it's a very different industry than your typical, stereotypical sort of muddy boots in the rain on a December weekend or a Friday, for example. Construction can be operating robotics. It can be the application of AI in terms of driving better productivity in the sector. Construction can be looking within the environment and how you increase biodiversity on particular land appraisals, for example. There are so many facets to construction and infrastructure. My advice would be to sample the buffet. Just dip your toe into as many of those things as you like and see what sort of sticks. But it's not a one. It's not just a one flavour. There's lots out there you can really do.
Do KPMG have a apprenticeship program?
We do, and we support across multiple areas as well. So we also have an outreach as well. We've got a prison reoffender program as well. So we have a couple of ex-offenders within our team as well. Could we be doing more? Yes, I think so, definitely. Again, we have a very diverse team, not your sort of stereotypical consultants. Again, I wouldn't be one of those sort of typical consultant types, if you like. We have a broad team, but yes, we could be more diverse for sure.
So when you talk about a diverse team, are you happy to kind of go into a little bit more detail? We don't need names or anything like that, but just What is it that makes them diverse, and how they all come together?
Yeah, definitely. So we're diverse in terms of the backgrounds and the skill sets we bring. So I have individuals in my team who come from an audit background, for example, chartered accountants who are now spending their time in infrastructure and construction. I have leaders who have worked client side on oil and gas, females who have worked in a very male industry dominated industry who are now working with us to help leaders to be able to transform their businesses. We have everything from your typical, again, your consultants that sort of come from, perhaps private education, etc. That may be stereotypical for KPMG, but we also have people who come from different backgrounds and all walks of life as well.
What's the best thing about working for KPMG for you?
I think that just the flexibility and the diversity of the work that we do. There's not a single day where I have a meeting which is very similar to the previous meeting or the previous meeting from the day before. There is so much sort of room to grow, and there's so much sort of area in which we can support. But ultimately, it's also having a seat at that sort of executive level table, if you like, to be able to really influence the very early stages of projects. Again, as an engineer, I'd often receive a sort of a brief or a sort of a definition quite late on, so the room in which you can maneuver is quite limited at that point. So the opportunity to be able to bring the knowledge of, again, how the sector really operates and the challenges there up to the executive board table, so that when the decisions are making, they are doing it with a real sort of transparency of impact on those decisions. That's a great place to be.
Kevin, it's been good catching up with you. I really appreciate your time and your wisdom coming on the podcast. I see the passion within you. Hopefully someone listening, as you have said, will take what you have said and be able to implement that and apply that, not just for their own good, but I think for the good of the industry and ultimately the country and maybe even the world as well, being that your organisation is a global one.
Indeed. Well, thank you for having me. I hope this message lands for a few people and take some insight from it and get on board with infrastructure, because it's a wonderful sector to be in.
Just before we do close up, though, is there anything that that we've not discussed that you think would be a good thing to cover off?
Yeah, maybe just on the on the global stage. I think within our domestic market, this is the UK itself. There's a lot of information out there around productivity. We very much sort of overlay with aeronautical and automotive around productivity and gains that have happened in that sector. UK construction sits something like 13.5% below the national average, not alone what the higher performing industries are doing. And we quite often sort of see this as a sort of a UK challenge, and isn't the UK infrastructure industry so bad and so poor, etc. But when you look across the global scale, and again, I have a real privilege of being able to support governments across multiple countries, clients in multiple countries. The productivity conundrum isn't a UK challenge at all. I've just come from a trip from Sydney, for example. Productivity in Australia is not good either. In fact, it's a lot worse than what we have here in the UK. So I suppose my message on a global scale is we do a lot that's really good in the UK. So I think there's an opportunity to sort of lift our heads up a little bit. And yes, there are things that we can do, and there's a lot of innovation we can start to bring. But I think we should be proud about the achievements that we do and the things that we do on a regular basis, and just share some of that across, because I think, unfortunately, there's a lot in the media around the negative parts of infrastructure, when housing doesn't meet the certain quality points, or this capital project has been cancelled by the government, or whatever it might be. But let's look at the real achievements that infrastructure has delivered for people and for society. A real life example, so I won't mention his name specifically, but again, when we look at the outcomes on the behalf of the citizens, these individuals who are going to gain as a result of the infrastructure. A colleague of mine has a sister who's visually impaired and also has other sort of disabilities, or very complex needs, but yet she was able to take a trip from the north of the UK to London to visit her brother entirely on public transport. That wouldn't have been possible without the kind of transport links that we have in the UK. And there's a lot of other countries that don't provide that kind of level threshold, that kind of service, if you like, to provide that journey for the individual. So again, from the individual lens of the citizen, there's a lot of great news out there. So let's maybe talk about some of that rather than some of the negatives.
I love that. We're not perfect, but we're not terrible.
Indeed.
That is good. That example that you've given of Crossrail there is, I think will dwarf what could happen with HS2 if you can connect the north with the south, and better connect the north with the north. And I don't know, do you get involved in those types of things as well?
A little bit, yes,
Okay.
a little bit.
And I appreciate that that the news feeds and the news publishers and producers jump up and down on the negative, the cost, this and the this, that, and the other. But so many people would use it.
Indeed.
If it was there.
Well, again, in that example I gave on the individual and the Crossrail example, so how do you put a price to someone who is now able to come from the north of the UK to meet their brother entirely using public transport? You know, that wouldn't have been possible. And her needs are such that, you know, being in a car for that sort of period of time isn't sensible either. You know, it's not a good journey to sort of have. So there's very little like money you can attach to individuals and they have that sort of mobility that they didn't have before. So yeah, there was a lot of good news stories, and you know, HS2 could be certainly one of those.
Kevin, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. See you soon.